In relation to Photoshop for amateur photographers, I think this topic is rather late coming, but a situation cropped up recently and I realised that perhaps there's a need. To become more skilled and confident with image editing, it's quite important that a correctly exposed image is the best place to start. If we're trying to learn editing on a badly exposed image, it's going to be a lot harder to do. It'll take far too long, even if you have the skills to do it, and it's unlikely to produce an acceptable result. Here's a practical exercise that anyone can do that explicitly demonstrates why exposure sometimes goes wrong. Now, when it does, it can often be beyond our expertise to fix things in Photoshop. Take a white and black card outside on a sunny day and take a frame-filling shot of each, but record the shutter speed and aperture that the camera chooses for both of these cards. Now you can see my settings here. We can use manual settings or automatic settings, it really doesn't matter. When you get these two images onto your computer, you're going to see something like this. It's a mid-tone grey and it's clearly wrong. Now if we imagine that the white card is a snow scene and perhaps the black card as a black steam engine parked in a dark coal yard, well, we don't want them to turn out grey. So what's gone wrong here? Because the white card, or our snow scene, should be white, and the black card, or our old steam engine, should be black. Well, actually nothing has gone wrong, but we have just witnessed the limitations of the exposure in our camera. Our camera measures reflected light, and more light is reflected from a bright subject, like a white card, and less from a dark subject, like a black card. The camera sees all of that whiteness, be it a white card or a snow scene, and it can be fooled into reducing the exposure to a point that we get mid-grey. With the black card, less light is reflected from it, and the camera can be fooled into thinking it needs to increase the exposure, again resulting in a mid-grey. Our cameras are calibrated to expose correctly for an average subject. But what exactly is an average subject? Let's take a look at this image, which has come straight from my camera. I'm going to remove the colour and I'm going to completely blur the image, and surprise, surprise, we get that same mid-grey. Now our camera's exposure meter is calibrated to give us a good exposure if it sees something like 18% grey, something like what we're seeing here. So let me compare an actual 18% grey with our blurred image. We find they are virtually identical, and it's because this image is an average one, meaning it contains a mix of tones that when blurred match the calibration of our cameras, and the result is a well-exposed picture. So in my white and black card exercise, what do we need to do to get the white card to record white? I actually have to increase the exposure by 2 full stops. This means I've got to double the exposure twice. Now I can do this by slowing down the shutter speed from 1/500th of a second to 125th of a second. A slower shutter speed, of course, will let in more light, increasing the exposure. To record the black card as black, I have to decrease the exposure 2 full stops. That's halving the exposure twice. Now I can do this by speeding up the shutter speed from the original 1/30th of a second to 1/60th and then 125th of a second. A faster shutter speed, of course, reduces the light captured from the black card. If increasing exposure for the white card and decreasing it for the black card sounds very confusing and counterintuitive to you, that's pretty good evidence that this topic is intended for you, because you do need to understand and know exactly what's happening here and why. This knowledge was a eureka moment for me way back in my film days. It's one of those times that when we realise what's happening and how it affects all of our photography, we have one of those smack-on-head moments where we can't seem to understand how we found this so confusing. But in fact it is confusing until you realise how the camera reads light. Our camera is a pretty dumb machine because it doesn't know if we are shooting a sunlit snow scene or a black steam train in the depths of an old coal yard. So anytime we point our camera at a scene that's not average, one that contains lots of light tones or lots of dark tones, we have to step in and compensate for the exposure the camera will give. Now, most cameras have a button or a wheel on the back to allow exposure compensation to be applied even when the camera is raised to our eye. Now, of course, not every scene is going to be quite as obvious as my examples, but imagine a scene that contains lots of dark tones, but also a few highlights. The camera is going to try to expose more for the shadows because there's more of them. And then the highlights may be so bright that they spoil the shot. They become impossible to deal with our image editor. Imagine a scene that contains quite a lot more highlights and light areas than it does shadows. Once again, the camera is likely to be fooled by the bright light tones and badly underexpose the shadows. It's all the same principle. The camera reads reflected light. The issue that I've raised here is one of those I wish I'd learned much earlier than I did, because it has such a big impact on our photography at the taking stage and also the editing stage. Of course, there are degrees of under and overexposure, and many of those can be dealt with effectively in Photoshop and Adobe Camera Raw. It's generally on those bright sunny days when contrast is high where this issue can become a little more critical. Now that's because our room for error is reduced in high contrast conditions. Trying to perform miracles on an image that is beyond your expertise and maybe beyond even an expert is not going to help your learning process, and it'll frustrate the hell out of you. I'll see you next time.